right, so last week we looked at post-millennialism and amillennialism. I want to say some more about amillennialism today because that's going to be the main foil that I use as the course goes on. Okay. Can anyone, though, remember what post-millennialists teach? So post, we'll just put post M. Okay, so what does a post-millennialist teach? Come on.
The millennium has already occurred?
Well,
No.
The rapture will
Thank you, but
The rapture will be after the millennium.
no.
Nope.
Not talking about the rapture.
Okay, well then Jesus will return.
The return of Jesus will be after the millennium. Okay. But there's something,
Oh, the 1,000 years, we're in the 1,000 years now.
that's our millennialism.
Okay.
It's okay. It can be confusing. It can be confusing. All right, so post-millennial, first of all, let me just say, post-millennialism and amillennialism are very strongly related, because what Karen just said there about the millennium will occur and then Jesus will come back, both systems believe that. So both systems are in a sense post-millennial in that sense. Okay? Both believe that the millennium occurs and then Jesus returns post-millennial. The idea of post, pre, and so on has to do with the return of Christ. Where do you put it? All right? So if the return of Christ is post-millennial, that means it's after the millennium. Okay? Now, in general, a post-millennialist will believe that the church will, through the work of the Spirit and the spreading of the gospel, will bring in the millennium. Do you remember that? The church will bring in the millennium. So, give you an example. I'll get rid of this. And we'll reiterate a few times here. All right, so here's the cross. All right, and we've got church history, which has gone for like 2,000 years, okay, so far. Now, in a post-millennial view, here's history, the line of history. And here's the second coming of Christ, okay? In a post-millennial view, what they will do is that they will say that at some point there will be a work of the Spirit, maybe slow, but it will start, and there will be a work of the Spirit. So let's say that work of the Spirit starts here. We don't know when Christ is coming back, but let's say it starts at this point here, and we'll just put a date of the year 2000. Okay? Then many post-millennialists will say that this period of bringing in the millennium and then the actual start of the millennium, an end, okay, will be before Jesus comes back. This is not to scale, okay? So this could be as long as this, okay? Most post-millennialists do not believe that when the millennium is brought in by the church, that it will be 1,000 years long, okay? They don't take the 1,000 years literally. Like nearly everybody else, apart from the system that I'll be teaching here, they spiritualize in large part the book of Revelation, and they say it's symbolic, therefore all the numbers are symbolic, therefore the 1,000 years is symbolic, so we don't need to believe in it literally. But you get the idea. Okay, so a post-millennialist believes the church is going to bring in the millennium at some point. And then after that, when there's been a certain amount of, hundreds of years, maybe 1,000 years, who knows, of the church and of Jesus Christ bringing in the kingdom on earth, then Christ will come back. After that, because the millennium has already happened, do you see? There's no need for a millennium after Jesus returns, because Jesus returns after the millennium. Are you okay with that? I didn't ask you if you agreed with it. I asked you if you get it. All right? All right. I mean, if you want me to, this might help the visual. Okay, if we just do this, make this bigger. Okay, and we start at, say, here, whatever date that is. So the church will bring in the millennium. And we can put the 2000 date here, and that might be a better visual for you. Okay? Rather than squidging it at the end. So there's your post-millennial. Now, an amillennialist, and we'll be doing a little bit more about that. An amillennialist believes that we're in the millennium now. Now, post-millennialists might believe that we're not in the millennium now, okay, because the church hasn't brought it in. But an amillennialist does believe we're in the millennium now. So what we do is we get rid of this. Church isn't going to bring the millennium in. And we say that from the cross to the second coming, it's all the millennium. So we're in the millennium now. All right? That's our millennialist. So the millennium is now, Christ comes back after the millennium. So our millennials are actually post-millennials.
Yes.
Just of a different stripe, okay? And remember I said, our millennial, that term was only invented about the 1920s, okay? So before that, they were called post-millennialists. All right, so because they believe that the millennium happens and then Christ comes back after the millennium. They just don't believe that the church brings in the millennium. They just believe we're in the millennium. The millennium is spiritualized, which means that an amillennialist believes that the millennium is just the church age, if you like. Well, no, I can't even say that because many of them are Presbyterians and they believe the church age started with Adam. But from the time of the first coming of Christ to the second coming of Christ, okay, that's the millennium in our millennialist view. A post-millennialist of the modern stripe, well, the older stripe was basically believe this too, is that the church is going to bring in the millennium. So all of the period from the cross of Christ to the second coming is not the millennium in a post-millennial view, whereas in an amillennial view it is. I know I'm repeating myself, but it's I think I have to, okay? But in a post-millennial view, the millennium will be brought in by the church and then Christ will come back. All right? So that's amillennial. Neither position believes that there is a millennium after the second coming of Christ, because it's already here, yes? Before them. So both positions are also amillennial, which means no millennium, meaning no millennium after the second coming of Christ. So if this isn't enough to confuse you, both positions are post-millennial and both positions are amillennial. But when we're differentiating, post-millennial believes that we're going to bring in the kingdom, the millennium, and that will be a time of peace and prosperity and everything for the nations. And then Christ will come back, and then there'll be new heavens and new earth. And our millennialist just believes that what's going on today is just going to keep going. Maybe at the end of time there'll be a mass conversion of the Jews, but most of them believe then there'll be a falling away of the church. Then Christ will come back, and new heavens and new earth. But the whole shooting match is the millennium. So it's a different view of the millennium, but the millennium is still before the second coming. All right? Yep. Okay. So let me read to you again more of what an amillennialist says. Okay? So this time this is from a book, The Meaning of the Millennium, and this is an amillennialist called Anthony Hoekema. You wouldn't have heard of him, but some people on the tape would have heard of him. He's a very well-respected amillennial theologian, very well regarded. So several places in his essay here that I want to just bring out for you, okay? He starts out by saying, amillennials, that's an unfortunate name. Wish we didn't have it, because they don't deny the millennium. They say we're in the millennium. They just deny a future millennium. Okay? So he says that. And he starts off by saying, if you'll turn to Revelation 19 and 20, if you go there, Revelation 19 and 20. He starts out by saying that chapter 20 of the book of Revelation does not follow chapter 19 of the book of Revelation chronologically. Okay? They deny, all our millennialists deny that chapter 20 of Revelation follows chapter 19 of Revelation chronologically. Now, looking at chapter 19 of the book of Revelation, okay, you will see that it says at the beginning, after these things I heard a loud voice and a great multitude in heaven saying, Hallelujah, salvation and glory and honor and power belong to the Lord our God. And then what you have is some praise going on, and you have the marriage of the Lamb, verse 7 and following. And then verse 11, now I saw heaven opened, and behold a white horse, and he who sat on him was called Faithful and True. In righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes were like a flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns. This is Jesus at his second coming, yes? Yeah, look at verse 16. His name is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. This is Jesus, yes? Second coming, yes? Then it goes into a battle. This is, often we might describe this as Armageddon, but he's coming and he's squishing people, basically, okay? And then what you find is from verses 20 and 21, the beast and the false prophet are captured and cast into the lake of fire. And then the rest are killed, verse 21. All right? Now look at chapter 20. It says, Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. They do not believe that follows chronologically from the second coming of Christ. Okay? He writes this, page 156 of the book. let us further assume that what is presented in Revelation 20 must necessarily follow in chronological order what was described in chapter 19. We are then virtually compelled to believe that the 1,000-year reign depicted in chapter 20 verse 4 must come after the return of Christ described in 1911. But if we see Revelation 20 verses 1 through 6 as describing what takes place during the entire history of the church, we're in the millennium now, okay? So what are they doing? They're taking the 1,000 years, the repetition of the word 1,000 years in Revelation 20, and they're saying that's spiritualized, and it refers to the period between the first and second comings of Christ. Okay? So if we see that it takes place during the entire history of the church, beginning with the first coming of Christ, we will have an understanding of the millennium of Revelation 20, which is quite different from the one just mentioned. It certainly will. Okay? So an amillennialist goes to the book of Revelation, goes to chapter 20, and they say chapter 20 happens before chapter 19. Now, there are places in the book of Revelation that it does that, okay? It takes you back to a particular scene, okay, to hone in on something that's happened or has just been described, okay? But that doesn't seem to be happening at all in chapter 19 and 20. It doesn't seem to be that way at all. This just seems to follow chronologically just as much as chapter 21 and 22 follow chapter 20. You know? Anyway, to continue, he will, they all do this to kind of prove the fact that in chapter 20, Satan being bound has already happened. Okay, they will quote New Testament verses like Matthew 12:29. How can one enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man? Okay, so Jesus has already bound Satan, you see. So as you have in Revelation 20, the binding of Satan with a chain and put in a bottomless pit, then that's the binding of Satan that Jesus is referring to in Matthew. Okay? You also get Jesus saying if he was casting out demons as an evidence of the presence of the kingdom of God, Matthew 12:28. He says on page 163 here, when the 70 returned from their preaching mission, they said to Jesus, Lord, even the demons submit to us in your name. Jesus replied, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Luke 10, verses 17 and 18. Okay, so the falling of Satan like lightning from heaven, okay, is described as the fall of Satan from his power, place of power. That's what, in this book, Understanding Prophecy, the Amillennialist in this book, Benjamin Merkel, that's what he says that means, okay? So it's interpreted to mean that his fall from power. And so it goes. It says, it's here, but Merkel says it more concisely. He says that in the book of Hebrews, where it says that Jesus was manifest so that he may destroy him who has power over death, that is the devil. Well, that means the devil's been destroyed already. Okay? Which means not that he's been destroyed, but means that his power base has been destroyed. Okay? That's the idea there. Now, if you see what they're doing, they're taking these outside verses and they're bringing them into Revelation, and they're interpreting Revelation by those verses. But those verses are not like slam dunk verses at all. Okay, you have to interpret them, and there are other ways to interpret them, okay, which do not imply amillennialism. But they are driving an interpretation of the book of Revelation from outside the book of Revelation, because these verses are not written by John. Okay? So what often happens with these people is that they'll get passages from outside of different books, and they'll bring them in to interpret passages like the book Revelation chapter 20, instead of keeping with Revelation 20 and saying, what does it mean in its context? And they all do this. Every single one does this. Okay? The reason for it is they say Revelation chapter 20 is obscure. It's obscure. It's an obscure passage. They'll go to also the Old Testament prophecies in Isaiah chapter 11, Isaiah 2, Micah 4, Ezekiel 34, 36, 37, 40 through 48. They'll go to all these passages and they'll say they're obscure. There's a lot of obscure passages in Amillennialism. Okay? So what they do is they say, well, the rule is that you have to interpret the obscure passages in the light of clear passages. And that's their ticket, you see, to changing these passages. Of course, these passages are not obscure unless you don't believe what they say. Then all of a sudden, they are obscure. But that's true in life, isn't it? If you don't believe what somebody's saying, then all of a sudden what they're saying becomes obscure. And you have to believe something else. Yeah? Isn't that true? He says here, page 172, our millennialists believe that though many Old Testament prophecies are indeed to be interpreted literally, many others are to be interpreted in a non-literal way. In the abstract, an amillennialist might agree with the definition of the premillennial method, hermeneutical method, given by Walvoord. He's a premillennial scholar. But he says this: the difference between an amillennial and a premillennial interpreter comes out when each tries to indicate which prophecies must be interpreted literally and which prophecies are to be interpreted in a non-literal sense. On this question, there would be a wide divergence of opinion. Okay? Which Old Testament prophecies are to be interpreted literally, which are to be interpreted in a non-literal sense. Okay? I will tell you, to save time, which ones they believe are to be interpreted literally. The ones, basically, that support the first coming of Christ. Okay? So he'll be born of a virgin. He'll be born in Bethlehem. Okay? Those are to be interpreted literally. Ride a donkey. Okay? What about the ones that are to be interpreted non-literally? The majority of prophecies in the Old Testament are to be interpreted non-literally. Why? Because the majority of prophecies in the Old Testament, if you interpret them literally, don't refer to the first coming of Christ. They refer to the second coming of Christ. Do you see? And there's an assumption going on in his mind that you have to get. Quote, page 177. Christ delivered a death blow to Satan and his evil hosts. This victory of Christ was decisive and final. The most important day in history, therefore, is not the second coming of Christ, which is still future, but the first coming which lies in the past. I have told you this, I've read this before, I'm reading it to you again. They interpret the Bible by the first coming of Christ. That means they interpret those Old Testament prophecies by the first coming of Christ. But those Old Testament prophecies of peace and prosperity and Jerusalem being blessed and people coming to Jerusalem, that doesn't match the first coming because that didn't happen at first, did it? So they have to spiritualize. All of a sudden, those texts become obscure. Of course they're obscure if you're looking at them, okay, through the first coming lenses. I mean, if you're looking at the stars with the wrong end of the telescope, of course they become obscure, don't they? So don't fall for that. They will tell you that. Okay, it's a good line for them. Okay, we interpret. They sound very pious when they say it. We interpret the obscure passages by the clear passages. Don't let them get away with it. Say there's nothing obscure about Revelation 20. There's nothing obscure about Ezekiel 40 through 48. It's just you and your system can't believe it because your system of interpretation won't allow you to interpret it in a literal way. And all of a sudden, half of the biblical prophecies become obscure because you've got trying to fit them into the first coming of Christ. Of course they become obscure because they don't fit. Do you see? There is a book, a commentary on the book of Revelation by a great New Testament scholar called William Hendrickson called More Than Conquerors. More Than Conquerors. It's a commentary on the book of Revelation, but where does the term more than conquerors come from? We are more than conquerors through him. That's in the book of Romans. What does that tell you about their method of interpreting the book of Revelation? They're going to go outside of the book of Revelation to interpret the book of Revelation. They're not going to interpret the book of Revelation by itself. Why? Oh, it's symbolic. Oh, it's obscure. Of course it's obscure if you believe this stuff. Do you see? That we're in the millennium already. And that therefore Revelation 20 comes before Revelation 19. Yeah? There was one more quote here I think I wanted to quote. Where is it? Page 181. Our millennials also teach that during this same 1,000-year period, which is this 2,000-year period, at least, the souls of believers who have died are now living and reigning with Christ in heaven while they await the resurrection of the body. Okay, so Christ is reigning and the dead are reigning now with Christ. Of course, you see, you have to have Christ reigning now because you can't have him reigning in a millennium on earth after, because you've done away with that. The Old Testament prophecies, well, let's look at Isaiah 11, okay, as an example of this. The Old Testament prophecies are very specific about the reign of Christ. Isaiah 11, again, there shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. Is that literal? No. It's a metaphor. It's a figure of speech. But it refers to Christ who comes from the lineage of David. Okay? The father of David is Jesse. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. Is that literal? Yes. His delight is in the fear of the Lord, and he shall not judge by the sight of his eyes, nor decide by the hearing of his ears, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his loins, and faithfulness the belt of his waist. Is that literal? Yes or no? No. There are figures of speech there clearly, but it's very easy to see that he's talking about the fact that he will reign and rule with righteousness, equity, bring about peace. That's basically what it's saying. Okay? Problem here, though, if you don't believe in a future time on earth like this, and that is he speaks about the poor and he speaks about the downtrodden and the meek. This can't be heaven, can it? But it's a time when the branch from David is reigning on earth. Okay? But not everything is completely right. He's putting things right. Do you see? So that kind of spells a bit of trouble for the Amillennialist. You see, he's going to have to spiritualize this. He's going to have to spiritualize the next bit particularly. The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, a little child shall lead them, the cow and the bear shall graze, their young ones shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play by the cobra's hole, and the weaned child shall put his hand in the viper's den. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as, similarly, the waters cover the sea. Is that literal? Is it or is it not? If you're an amillennialist and postmillennialist, it's not literal. If you believe in a future reign of Christ in peace on this earth in the future, it is literal. Do you see? Turn to Hosea chapter 2. Hosea chapter 2. So take a kind of a decent pinch of the Bible to the right. Go get past Ezekiel and Daniel. You there? You with... tell me when you're all there, Hosea 2. Verse 14. Therefore, behold, I will allure her, talking about Israel, will bring her into the wilderness and speak comfort to her. I will give her her vineyards from there, and the valley of Achor as a door of hope. What's the valley of Achor? That's the place where Achan was killed in time of Joshua. Okay? She shall sing there as in the days of her youth, as in the day when she came up out from the land of Egypt. Who's this talking about? Israel, all right? And it shall be in that day, says the Lord, that you shall call me my husband, and no longer call me my master. For I will take from her mouth the names of the Baals, and they shall be remembered by their name no more. In that day I will make a covenant with them, with the beasts of the field, with the birds of the air, with the creeping things of the ground. Bow and sword of battle I will shatter from the earth to make them lie down safely, and I will betroth you to me forever, for example. Okay? Here it says there's a covenant going to be made when God restores Israel to himself and actually marries Israel, I mean, you'll call me husband. Has that happened yet? Okay. Even if you spiritualize this and say this is written to the church, has Christ married the church yet? No. Okay. But here we are. Beasts of the field, birds of the air are somehow being changed, aren't they? Just as in Isaiah 11. Notice here, bow and battle and sword of battle I will shatter from the earth. That's like Micah 4 and Isaiah chapter 2. Okay? In that passage, remember it talks about the fact that they will beat their swords into plowshares. Yeah? Talking about the same stuff. See how it connects? Literally it connects. Do you see? But if you're an amillennialist, you can't have that happen. Do you see? So you have to spiritualize it. One more quotation here. Where is it? Nope. I think it was here. Just one second. I think it was the Merkel quote. Okay, listen to this. This is Benjamin Merkel, page 260, 261 of Understanding Prophecy here. Okay, just listen carefully. You need to be in Revelation 20 here. The images are not to be taken literally, although they point to literal events and realities. So although the angel coming down from heaven in Revelation 20 is pictured as having a literal chain to bind Satan and a literal key to lock him up, these symbols relate to us God's intention to limit Satan's influence on the world. This binding is said to last 1,000 years. If the chain, key, and prison are symbolic pictures, then it is likely that the 1,000 years is also symbolic and represents a certain period of time, but not necessarily a literal 1,000 years. Second, John tells us that Satan is bound so that he might not deceive the nations any longer. Revelation 20 verse 3. Thus, Satan's influence is not completely removed, but is specifically tied to his ability to deceive the nations. You buying it? So we can take the reason for the binding literally, so that he doesn't deceive the nations. Okay? But we can't take the binding itself literally. Okay, the chain is not literal. The prison isn't literal. The thing on top of the abyss is not literal. The 1,000 years isn't literal. Do you see that? And the letting him out, obviously, isn't literal because he wasn't let into a literal prison in the first place. I said that where it says that he might not deceive the nations any longer, that they take that literally, but do they? Do they? Because they will say that this refers to not all of the people of the nations, but only to the elect. The elect are not going to be deceived. So the word nations doesn't mean nations, it means the elect from all the different peoples of the earth. So even that is given a qualified definition. All right? If you're going to interpret the Bible in this way, you can make it do almost anything you want it to do. And folks, they do. They do. All right. So that's Amillennialism. That's the main opponent of the position that I'm teaching here. But before we get to this position, dispensational premillennialism, the position that I'll teach from now on after this little lesson here, we have to get to historic come covenant premillennialism. Sorry. Has to be done. All right. So, let's see. So, in premillennialism, okay, premillennialism teaches, here's me blue. That Jesus comes back before the millennium. Yes, before the millennium. So how are you going to do this? Well, you have the cross, you have the return of Christ at some point, and then you have Christ setting up the millennium. Okay, and then you have the new heavens and new earth after that. Okay? So that's premillennialism. But there are two main sorts of premillennialism. And the historic covenant premillennialism will teach that, Jesus will come back and set up his millennium on earth. All right, good. That's good. That's good. Their main proof text is Revelation 20. In fact, for many people, including the most influential premillennialist, a man called George Eldon Ladd, that is the proof text. Okay? You say, well, what about the Old Testament prophecies? Ladd does not believe, not all premillennialists are like this, but Ladd does not believe that the Old Testament or the Gospels speak about a future kingdom. Okay? That it's only found in Revelation 20. Now, some of the older premillennialists, some of the Scottish writers, Robert Murray McCheyne, who you may have heard of, Horatius Bonar, A.A. Bonar, you may have heard of these men. If you haven't, you should do. They're great men. They were premillennialists in this view. All right? And they would sometimes go to these Old Testament passages and they will say, look, the Bible says that Israel will come back to the land. And so what you get is when Israel did come back to the land in 1948, you have premillennialists who would say, you see, because the Bible prophesies that. Okay? The Bible prophesies that. I'm not there yet. I will just tell you the Bible doesn't prophesy that, I don't think. The Bible prophesies another return after they've been expelled again. Okay. Okay, but that's for later on, and we can get to that when we hit that part of the course. But a historic premillennialist. Okay, a little bit here for you, because I know you love this stuff. All right. Alan Bandy is the premillennialist who wrote this book. These guys wrote this book together. They agree on nearly everything, which should tell you a lot. Okay? And they have two chapters where they disagree at the end of the book. Otherwise, they agree with each other. He says, historic premillennialism basically affirms some variation of the future fulfillment of prophecy, especially a literal, visible, glorious, and victorious return of Christ to earth at the end of the age. This position typically affirms that when Jesus returns, he will bind Satan, the saints will be raised, first resurrection, and they will reign with Christ in a millennium of peace and prosperity. Yet, not all historical premillennialists insist on a literal interpretation of the 1,000 years. And he writes in a footnote here, I believe that all numbers in Revelation have symbolic meaning and therefore should not be taken literally in every instance. As such, I'm not convinced that the millennium is actually comprised of a literal or 1,000 literal years. So the stuff there, when I started reading him, you thought, yeah, I agree with that. And then, hold on a minute. He's not going all the way, is he, though? Okay? He also believes the kingdom of God has already been inaugurated at the first coming. Okay? So his main interpretation, just as the amillennialist here, is going to be the first coming. He just believes that there are some scriptures that you can't cram into the first coming, so you've got to leave them for the second coming. He believes, and most premillennialists, in fact, I think all historic covenant premillennialists believe in one people of God. One people of God. All amillennialists and all postmillennialists believe in one people of God. Now, if there's only one people of God, who is it? Church. It must be the church, yes? So therefore, Israel, okay, as a nation, has no future. Do you see? Either with postmillennialists or amillennialists or historic covenant premillennialists, they all believe in the one people of God. Yeah? Now, they might get a little bit technical and say, yeah, but I understand that the Old Testament saints weren't really in the church, and the church began after the resurrection of Christ. But when you ask them, okay, but do you believe in two peoples of God there, therefore? People saved in the Old Testament period or before the ascension of Christ, and then those in the church afterwards. And they say, no, there's one people of God. Well, who are the one people of God? They have to be the church, folks. Okay? They have to be the church. You say, what did they do with Israel? They will often believe, and you can be post-millennial, amillennial, or historic premillennial, they will believe that God has a future for Jews being saved and incorporated into the church. The majority of Jews, you would agree, through church history have not been saved. Many amillennialists, not all of them by any means, but many amillennialists will believe that before the second coming of Christ, there will be a great revival in Israel, and many Jews will be saved and joined to the church, and that's what the salvation of the Jews will be. Okay? No national restoration, though. And historic premillennialists will agree with that view. As far as Old Testament prophecies, sometimes they will look at the restoration passages in the Old Testament. Isaiah 61 or 11 and 2 and so on. And they will say, yes, that's going to be the world when Christ comes back in the millennium, because they believe in a millennium. But they won't take the Israel, Jerusalem, locations that literally. And they'll all spiritualize Ezekiel's temple. There's no need for the Levitical sacrifices because the church doesn't need Levitical sacrifices, you see, and there's one people of God, the church. And as I read to you from this premillennialist, Alan Bandy, he believes the book of Revelation is full of symbols. So many historic covenant premillennialists will agree for the most part with our millennialists that the book of Revelation is not to be interpreted at face value. It's symbolic, highly symbolic, and those symbols don't, they have to be decoded and basically spiritualized, okay? George Eldon Ladd, here he in his essay, he takes most of the time knocking our position. But he just says, premillennialism is the doctrine stating that after the second coming of Christ, he will reign for 1,000 years over the earth before the final consummation of God's redemptive purpose in the new heavens and the new earth of the age to come. This is the natural reading of Revelation 21 through 6. He denies that there is a distinction between Israel and the church. So he's one people of God guy. Okay? He says, on page 20 here, the fact is that the New Testament frequently interprets Old Testament prophecies in a way not suggested by the Old Testament context. Okay? He gives you an example. Hosea 11:1, out of Israel I have called my son, which is quoted in Matthew 2:15 and applied to Jesus. All right? Well, we'll deal with that later on. But I will tell you that there is something else going on, and that Hosea is actually relying on the book of Numbers. Okay? So there's another connection there where it actually is Messiah. So there's a kind of a double meaning in that. Okay? He says the Old Testament is reinterpreted in light of the Christ event, the first coming of Christ. Okay? Reinterpreted. He does use the word. With regard to the first coming of Christ, he says the Old Testament is interpreted by the New Testament. Well, sure. And how does, in regard to the first coming of Christ, how does the New Testament interpret the Old Testament? Basically, literally. I mean, we would all interpret the prophecies of Christ in the same way. Okay? But when we come to the second coming of Christ, all of a sudden, a bunch of us start spiritualizing. That's the issue. Was there another quotation here I wanted to give you? I don't think so. He says, I can find no trace of the idea of either an interim earthly kingdom or of a millennium in the Gospels. No trace of an idea. Okay? And he does some good work here about refuting the Amillennialists and their interpretation. For reasons outlined above, he says on page 32, a millennial doctrine cannot be based on Old Testament prophecies, but should be based on the New Testament alone, and basically on the book of Revelation chapter 20. So a historic premillennialist has some stuff right, okay, as far as, and of course I'm saying that because I agree with them. I mean, an amillennialist say well, he's got it wrong. But yeah, he believes that after the second coming of Christ, it's going to be a literal millennium. But there's only one people of God. There's no restored nation of Israel in this millennium. Do you see? And the only reason that he's going for the millennium is basically because of Revelation 20. And not all, as you heard from Alan Bandy there, not all historic premillennialists believe that the 1,000 years is a literal 1,000 years. So they're very close to our millennialists, which is why he can write a book with an amillennialist. Here's one more quotation here that I've got to give you from George Eldon Ladd. After Anthony Hokuma's amillennial article, George Eldon Ladd, the historic premillennialist, starts by saying this: I am in agreement with practically all that Hoekemer has written, with the exception of his exegesis of Revelation 20. So you see how they get along, these guys? So if you want to be cool, you be a post-millennialist, an amillennialist, or a premillennialist in the historical covenant sense. Yeah? If you want to be uncool, then you agree with what I'm going to be teaching you. Here, you start to be a dispensational premillennialist. A dispensational premillennialist. Don't be put off by that term. I've already kind of explained it in a previous lesson, and we'll go on into that now. I don't like the term dispensational because I have very, very little time for dispensations or administrations or economies, like the dispensation of innocence in Eden, the dispensation of conscience outside of Eden, the dispensation of promise at the time of Abraham. Okay, I think these are really, they're not even the same in the same semantic domain, as far as a conscience is not the same thing as innocence. Okay, they relate to different things. An innocent person can have a conscience, can't they? Do you see? Law is not the same as innocence, is it? I mean, you can be innocent and still have law. These are different things, okay? Promise, well, what's that got to do with conscience or innocence? I mean, promise is a promise, isn't it? Whether you're innocent or guilty, whether you've got law or not. Do you see? Administrations of these things? I don't think so. They're just hard. And then you interpret the Bible by this. But the Bible doesn't do that. The Bible interprets itself through covenants. Covenants that God makes. Okay? So, I am a premillennialist, okay? But I believe in the biblical covenants. They're what make me a premillennialist. All right, any questions?
I thought you were a reluctant dispensationalist.
I am a reluctant dispensationalist. Yes, I am. Questions? Yes.
So, sorry, but from the beginning, when you started, the reason that they can say these things is because they spiritualize a lot of what they read in the Word of God. How do they fit this in with God is the same yesterday, today, and forever? He doesn't. I mean, what I hear them saying is that sometimes he talks this way to you and sometimes he talks that way to you.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, I mean, that's what they're saying basically?
All right. So let me just rephrase the question. The question is, if they're claiming that God spiritualized, or rather God's word has to be spiritualized in order to understand what God really means, then that means that what he said over here, which is not to be taken literally, but was taken literally, maybe, has a different meaning later on. And so God is speaking out of both sides of his mouth. Okay, so is that basically what you're saying? And what do they say? How do they respond to that? I've never had a clear response from anyone on that charge. What they tend to do is they tend to say, how dare you accuse God of doing that? But I don't believe God does that. You're the one who does. The logical outcome of believing that is that God is double-mouthed, that he's ambiguous in what he says. So how do you lock down meaning? Okay? And we'll be dealing with this a lot, so don't, just stick with it. But I must say this. Terry used the word spiritualization. They don't like that word. I know that Ladd used the term, okay? But they don't like that word. They say we don't spiritualize. We take it literally. Okay? In other words, and I know it's, I call it slippery language because what they mean by literal is not what you mean by literal. And if you did to their books what they do to the Bible, they would accuse you of misrepresenting their literal meaning. Okay? But they will come to the Bible and they will say, yeah, well, this is symbolic, so you've got to have the literal meaning of the symbol. So the literal meaning of the symbol is what we're looking for. When we've got that, we have a literal interpretation. Here's the problem. Half the time, it's not a symbol. It actually means what it says. The chain that is brought by the angel is a literal chain. The angel, the angelic being, what is he? Is he physical or is he mainly spiritual? Is he corporeal or non-corporeal? Well, an angel can take on the form of a man, but most of the time they're non-corporeal spirits, yes? You can't see them. Yes? They're called spirits in the book of Hebrews. And Satan is the same. He's a demonic spirit. He can take physical form, but he's a spirit. All right? So if God can make an angelic being and God can permit, because Satan is corrupted and distorted, the existence of demonic beings, isn't it pretty easy to create a spiritual chain to bind a demonic being? What's more difficult to make? An angel or a spiritual chain? Obviously, a spiritual chain is much easier to make, isn't it? So what's wrong with binding an angelic demon, if you want, being, Satan, with a chain suited to a demon and throwing him in a bottomless pit and putting the top over it? You say, well, that physicalizes things. Yeah, well, maybe there's a bit more physicality to this than we're allowing. Okay, but even if this is the realm of as it were, non-corporeality, spirituality, there's something going on here that we're not aware of. Maybe it's not completely spiritual. Maybe it is corporeal. We just don't see it. Do you see? Maybe it's just an invisible realm. Do you see? But is physical. So there's no need to start spiritualizing things. But again, they don't like the word spiritualize, and we'll come back to that. Any other questions? All right. All clear. Are we clear on this? Okay. One final rehearsal. Post-millennialists believe that the church will bring in the millennium, and then Jesus will come back, but there's no millennium after the second coming. Jesus comes back after the millennium. Yes, then you have the new heavens and new earth. But the church brings in the millennium, brings in the kingdom. Our millennialists believe that we're in the millennium now. Okay? The church is not going to bring it in, we're in it. Not necessarily going to get any better either. But Jesus comes back. Okay? And then new heavens and new earth. So there's no future millennium. So in this sense, post-millennialists are also amillennialists, because post-millennialists don't believe there's going to be a millennium after the second coming. And amillennialists are post-millennialists, because amillennialists agree with post-millennialists that the millennium will come in and then Jesus will come back. Okay? Because we're in the millennium now. A historic premillennialist believes that Jesus comes back and then there's a millennium of some kind of description, some kind of age after the second coming of Christ, and then you have the new heavens and new earth after that. But they don't believe that Israel has national restoration promises. They believe, again, like amillennialists and postmillennialists, that there is one people of God, basically the church. Okay? They do not believe in a distinction between Israel and the church, which is why their approach to the interpretation of prophecy is very often very, very similar to the amillennialist and the postmillennialist, which is why Ladd, who is the most influential prophecy scholar of the last probably 50 to 100 years, particularly in America. Ladd's been very, very influential. Ladd says he agrees with the amillennialist most of the time. And this is why Bandy, a premillennialist, historic premillennialist, can write a book with an amillennialist and agree most of the time with him. I couldn't, because I'd be constantly disagreeing with him, saying, it doesn't say that. Okay? It doesn't say that. That doesn't apply to the church. That's a second coming passage, not a first coming passage. Do you see? So that's where we're going next time. We're going to kind of clarify things. And I had to do this. I had to give you this stuff before we could move on. Yes?
Let's follow up that question I had last week, remember, about the 1,000-year reign and what we're supposed to be in it now. So we can't get along.
Yeah.
We're trying to make this happen. Where are we in their 1,000 years? I mean, what would they say?
The question is, this is the last question. The question is that since Christians can't get along either, okay, then when's this 1,000 years going to start? Okay? And, when are Christians going to start getting along? That's only a post-millennialist will say we will all, finally, the Holy Spirit will revive the church first before the world is saved, and everyone will be on basically the same page, which will be on our page. We'll be post-millennial, okay? So we'll all agree with that view. An amillennialist won't believe that because we're in the millennium now and things don't necessarily get any better. Do you see? In fact, an amillennialist will often say that that there will be an apostasy before the second coming of Christ. The church, things may get worse. Do you see? But they will deny a literal millennium after the second coming. All right. I can see that you've had enough. From now on in, it's much more plain sailing, I think.